Welcome to the New Big Five podcast. I'm Graham Green. My guest today is the English photographer Nick Brandt. Nick, thanks for being on the New Big Five podcast.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
As many people will know, Nick's work focuses on how the natural world is disappearing or being destroyed by humans. His most recent work, This Empty World, is an ambitious project highlighting the increasing clashes between humans and animals in places where animals no longer have space to live. Nick's also the co-founder of the Big Life Foundation, an organisation that combats poaching and other threats to wildlife in Africa. Nick, I think it's clear that photography for you is about having a message. Is that right?
Totally, yeah. The animals came first, not the photography. My desire and need to express my feelings about the natural world, about animals, was what motivated me towards photography as the ideal medium. It's a glorious medium because you can just go out and create what you want, how you want, when you want, within reason. And as much as I've kind of been resistant to digital, that has also increased the kind of democratization of ability to both create and disseminate one's photography.
It's a big question, but what good do you think photography can do?
That's such a hard question to answer. I never really know how much difference my photography, how much difference it can make. You just kind of plow on, hope you're making a bit of a difference, hope you're breaking through to some people, hope you're part of some incremental cog in a wheel of change. And it's just part of an overall struggle that gradually builds a growing awareness and dialogue across the world.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the ideal. Yeah. The ideal would be you just single-handedly with one photograph completely change the way every single person on the planet feels. But in lieu of that, an incremental wheel in the cog of change would be fine.
I always think it's good to flip it around, though. It's always hard to tell what good photography does, but if you took photography away, I think there are a lot of issues around the world that people wouldn't know about. Often it's photos that draw people into an issue or a story, isn't it?
Is it? I think there is such a overwhelming amount of information that comes our way every minute of the day with the advent of the internet. There's such a level of ADD, and I mean, I think we're all guilty of it, just constantly just what's the latest piece of news. So for then photographs to break through that, in addition to any kind of art form, becomes all the harder. People, and I think photography stands a better chance than some mediums, like novels, because it is in this ADD world, it is an instant hit. It requires only seconds to absorb a photograph. The problem then, however, is that most of the world now views everything through their phones, and it is so diminished, especially any visually complex work like This Empty World, is so diminished by, you can't really get a sense of it. You need to see it, as in its correct incarnation of a 9-foot print, 10-foot print, 12-foot print.
On that note, I did notice that you describe your Instagram account as reluctant. Does that fit with what you're saying there? Are you a reluctant Instagrammer?
I hate it. It's a necessary evil. I think, look, I've discovered some amazing photographers that I never knew of, especially some fantastic street photographers. But for any visually complex work, it's a disaster. And it's also just both in terms of the size of it and in terms of just people spending 2 seconds on it before they whiz on and they whiz on and they whiz on to the next photo. I know I sound incredibly kind of old-fashioned and middle-aged, but there it is.
Some photos do break through the bombardment, though, don't they? Your photos have brought attention to some issues or stories, and they've raised money for charities, for example. Do you have a way that you measure the impact of your photos?
I really, honestly have no idea. The only tangible, concrete difference that I know I have made is by co-founding Big Life Foundation, which has absolutely definitively resulted in 1.6 million acres of extraordinary African ecosystem being protected, and would be in a very different place now than had we not started it 10 years ago. That is tangible. And that is, to me, extremely significant and important and meaningful. It's not a direct result of the photographs, even though initially, a lot of the photography helped fund the startup of and early years of the organization, until we're at a point where there are donations that come in regardless of my photography.
I first came across your work several years ago when I saw your famous photo of a ranger holding a giant pair of tusks from a killed elephant in Amboseli in Kenya. That was a picture that went around the world and seemed to make a huge impression on people. Were you surprised when that photo went global and by the impact it had?
So that was 2013 when it was released. So that was 6 years ago. I'm really obviously delighted that you say that. Again, maybe I just live in a complete bubble, but I have no awareness of. I mean, I know it's a well-known photograph, but I kind of have no awareness of it to the degree that you've just described. I hope it would, because I do think it's a very powerful, simple image that, those, as I'd mentioned, the tusks of that particular elephant. There is no elephant left alive on the planet today with tusks that size. And the ranger who is supporting those tusks in that position of, is he supporting them, or is he bowed in prayer? Is he bowed in mourning? I like the ambiguity, I think, of that image. And it probably works because it's so visually simple and graphic. It can translate into a thumbnail size image and still tell the story.
As you've said, it's not easy nowadays to grab and hold people's attention with an image, particularly when we see so many images every day. So what is important to you in a photo? Do you think about the impact a photo will have and whether it will stand out?
No, I don't think about that at all. I only think about what inspires, excites me in the moment, that I am interested in, that I am obsessed about. I'm not thinking about how will anybody else respond to it. Doesn't enter my head. It's about because then what you're doing is you're kind of second guessing. You're not actually. I just don't think that's true creation somehow. I don't. It's a clumsy way of putting it. I think I'm going to regret saying that, but I just think you should create for yourself. Yeah. And that however people react afterwards, if they get it, fantastic. If they don't, at least you were true to your own vision and exploring your own obsession, and let the chips fall where they may.
I didn't really just mean how people respond, but I'm asking what's vital to you in a good photo. Can you put your finger on what you're trying to achieve with one of your photos? How do you know when you have something that you love and that does something for you, for example, versus something that doesn't? What's the essence of a good photo for you?
I can't tell whether I have a good photograph until I see it printed. Every single photographer on the planet has gone through the process where you believe you have taken an extraordinary photograph, and then reviewing your contact sheets, in that time, a week later, a month later, whenever, the photograph that you were so excited about is so boring that you can't even find it on the contact sheet. What on earth, what were you taking that you thought it was so brilliant at the time? So then that extends for me to then viewing it on a computer screen. I think computer screens are very seductive in that so much looks good backlit on a computer screen. And for me, I can't tell whether I've taken a good photograph until not just it's a small print, but it's a big print. We do these endless test prints at 10, 12 feet long. And it's only when I can look at a large print standing back from it and that I can say, yeah, okay, that kind of works. And I can look at a photograph on the computer screen, think it's, yeah, that's great. And I print it and I go, no. And it's sort of, I find it quite disturbing how few photographers don't regard printing as an essential, critical part of the process anymore.
But when you look at those printed photos, what is it that makes you say yes, that you've got something there?
You know I'm avoiding this question because I can't give you an answer. Because I have no idea. You can't put your finger on it. Surely, I would imagine most people would most creators of any kind of art form not say the same thing. They wouldn't be able to logically, rationally analyze it. They would just simply go, I don't know, it's just this feeling, this intangible feeling.
That must make it a lot of fun then when you get to deciding what pictures are going to go into a book or an exhibition.
Well, I have my brutal critic, which is my wife, to lacerate away and make utterly, brilliantly lacerating comments that will just make me cut them quicker than you can. I don't know, I can't think of how to finish that sentence, but very quickly.
I'm just going to pause there for a second. I want to briefly explain to people listening that this podcast we're doing is part of the New Big Five project, where we're creating a new Big Five of wildlife. As many people know, the old Big Five was based on the toughest animals in Africa for hunters to shoot and kill. The new Big Five that we're setting up is about wildlife photography rather than hunting, shooting with cameras, not guns. Through the project, we're also trying to raise awareness about issues to do with wildlife, conservation, climate change, and more. So I just want to take the chance to ask people listening to go onto the New Big Five website, newbig5.com, and to vote for their own personal choices for 5 animals they'd like to be included in the New Big Five. Nick, I wondered what your thoughts are on the New Big Five project and this idea of celebrating these animals when they're alive, rather than something that always seemed very strange to me, when they're hunted and dead.
Yes, I think what is quite hard to decide is what merits or constitutes the Big Five, because as various species become more and more rare, endangered, I think that list is going to need to fluctuate, to shift. So, right now, today, I'd be putting orangutan on that list, for example, because of what's going on with orangutans. I'd be putting some very unglamorous animals on, like a pangolin. You know what I mean? It's just, I'm thinking about it from a conservation perspective, not a photographic perspective. So for me, it's actually quite hard to think of it in terms of a photographic perspective, even though that's what I had spent many years doing. So I think it shifts. I don't think, for example, you would put a buffalo on a 5 now.
No, that's exactly my thinking, that an animal like a buffalo isn't something people necessarily travel to see anymore. Game hunting has become something far less relevant to the majority of people, and wildlife photography has become far more relevant. So I do like this idea, like you've just said, that we might get orangutans in the new Big Five, or polar bears, or other animals.
Exactly. And also the other thing is people still perceive, subconsciously or otherwise, of that phrase Big Five relating to only African mammals.
Sure.
And obviously, really, it should relate globally. which is where things like orangutans and polar bears come into the mix.
Game hunting is something that still goes on, of course, and it's something that really baffles me. As a photographer, I really love to see wildlife in Africa, in Asia, in South America, anywhere it is. It never strikes me as something I'd like to do, to see a lion or an elephant and to want to kill it. I just don't understand it. What are your thoughts on hunting?
I personally find the killing of any animal for pleasure absolutely abhorrent, unequivocally. I cannot comprehend how anybody would take pleasure in extinguishing the life of an animal that a moment before was living out its life happily out in the wild and then was basically extinguished. That, I mean, look, I'm struggling to find the words because I find it such an abomination. And I don't care how many hunters I offend in that regard. There is a however, and this is where I kind of end up losing donations for Big Life, which is the necessary evil part, which is that there are parts of Africa where there are large hunting concession areas, where those areas still only have wildlife in them because of hunters coming in and paying out huge amounts of money for the perverse pleasure of extinguishing beautiful animals.
Yeah.
You kind of get into conversations of pragmatism. I, as a purist rather than a pragmatist, am extremely uncomfortable with it and would just prefer that hunters did something less destructive with their lives, more constructive, and that we kind of could, in an ideal world, rely on dollars from photography tourism to keep those places going.
For the new Big Five project, I'm asking every photographer I talk to for their choice of their top 5 animals. You mentioned orangutan and pangolin before. Conservation is a part of this, but mainly we're asking for the 5 animals you love to take photos of or to see in photos. What would your top 5 be?
If you include the photographic consideration, I wouldn't include pangolin. Yeah. I've never photographed an orangutan. I know that I've never seen one in the wild. I want to, I plan to, I hope to. I know that I will fall madly in love with them. I think they're extraordinary looking creatures. They would be my current number one because, of course, I spent years photographing animals in Africa. You have to include elephant just because they are so extraordinary and charismatic. I cannot help but also have to therefore include gorillas. And again, it's just the reason I'm pausing is because I'm thinking of those moments when you are in close proximity to a gorilla or an elephant and the indefinable charisma of their presence and frequently personality. So those are the 2 standout African animals for me. So that makes 3. Again, I've never been to anywhere cold, but I kind of would be very tempted to include polar bears because of their endangered nature, because again, any bear to me is surely extraordinarily charismatic as a presence. That would make number 4. And then number 5.
There are no big cats in your choices yet. Would a lion or a leopard or a cheetah maybe be options to go in there?
Hold on. I'm doing a kind of planetary flyover currently. Well, because the thing is, of course, is that I don't know. I mean, maybe some photographers
It's a fun question, isn't it?
Have taken photographs of all the major animals worldwide. I haven't. So I'm imagining what it's like to be close to a polar bear and close to an orangutan. So in the absence of that, I will just make the African lion number 5.
Great, thanks. That's a really good 5. And out of those, what would your number 1 favorite be? I know elephants feature a lot in your work, but you spoke very passionately just there about gorillas.
It is elephants, and it comes from spending many hours in close proximity where you don't go to them, they come to you. And a family of elephants gather around your vehicle. And I've had baby elephants come up to me that, so close that I can touch them from the car because the family's just munching away, just like around where the car was parked. And that, for me, sitting there for hours, never ever ceases to instill an absolute sense of wonderment. I have such a general impatience with so much about humanity, but with animals, I never lose my patience, and I can very happily sit for hours and hours doing nothing but just gazing at them when they're in such close proximity and just getting on with their daily lives. But then, I can do that with my dog. I can just sit quite happily and watch my dog snurfling through the grass for hours. So it's just animals in general, I think.
Coming back to your photography, your newest collection, which is also a book, is called This Empty World, which I know took months of work and complex planning. If you're listening to this on YouTube or Vimeo or on the website, hopefully we'll be showing a few of the photos from This Empty World here, and we'll put some up on the new Big 5 website with the readable version of this interview too. Nick, can you tell us a bit about the photos in This Empty World and particularly the ideas behind the project?
Sure. So what I have become over the years painfully increasingly aware of is that the biggest challenge facing the natural world in Africa today is the disappearance of wildlife habitat, the disappearance of space, that in spite of people's notion that it's an antiquated notion, the idea that Africa is a vast land of wilderness where animals can still roam freely. There are very, very, very few places left in the world where animals still roam in unprotected land. And so that was the kind of starting point for the concept of This Empty World. And so what I did is we set up a series of cameras across a large, very eroded, populated area of Maasai community ranch land in southern Kenya, close to Amboseli National Park. And we set up lighting that would imitate all manner of industrial and urban kind of lighting, be it construction, be it light coming from buses, from petrol stations, from construction work, whatever. And then the animals were encouraged with water holes to come gradually, eventually, hopefully, into frame, where their movement would trigger the cameras and the lights so that they would be photographed. There were also in those places kind of embryonic elements, foreground elements of the sets that would ultimately be built. The camera never moved. Over weeks, we would wait for any animals that we hoped might come into frame, be photographed in that setting. There were 10 cameras in total across the ecosystem running like this. And some of those cameras would be up for 6 weeks, some of them were up for 5 months. Eventually, with time running out, we then, with the camera remaining completely locked in place, built sets that, what that lighting source was emanating from. So if it was a petrol station, fluorescent light, we built a petrol station. In all of these instances, bar a few shots, the camera was locked in place so that where the animal was photographed and where what came after it, which was the set and the people, were all shot from the exact same camera position, so that when everything was blended in post, it was true, it had integrity, everything belonged in its natural place, bar a few shots, which were out of practical necessity.
It's a very strange thing to see these wild elephants, lions, rhinos, hyenas, giraffes, all in settings, as you said, like petrol stations, rubbish dumps, building sites. It's a very jarring effect.
So obviously, I mean, it's not real life, but it is symbolic of what is happening, which is this invasion of the human world progress, rapidly invading what remains of natural wildlife habitat. Along the way come humans as well. And what was very important in this work is that the humans in the photographs, who were cast from local communities, that they never came across as the villains, that they also were victims of environmental degradation. And because typically in communities like that, it's the rural poor who are most immediately impacted by environmental degradation. So again, you can't see this on your phone because you can't see all the expressions on the faces that you can see in the 10-foot prints. But you see that everyone is rendered homeless. Everybody is a refugee, both human and animal. I mean, what I found really quite scary and exciting was working in color for the first time, working digital for the first time, and using color in as an expressive a way as I could, by which I mean embracing the kind of garish, sickly, modern world colors of orange sodium lights of construction lights, and sickly fluorescent green coming from petrol stations, and these kind of vivid blues and reds emanating from local buses, so that the animals were lit in ways, illuminated in headlights and by red tail lights, lit in ways that I don't think we've ever seen before in the photography of animals in the wild.
Human-wildlife conflict is one of the most pressing issues in Africa. When it comes to this issue of human-wildlife conflict, what would you like to see happen?
We have to address population, and people don't like to talk about it because it's not politically correct. But and I don't know really how you do it, other than the quickest way that you can reduce population is increase personal wealth, decrease poverty. As poverty decreases, the size of families also decreases, as I think people become more secure. They don't need a huge family to support them. With lower poverty comes lower population. And this is actually something that, again, I should talk about in relation to this empty world, which is people will say, well, you've got to allow Africa to develop economically. And that's absolutely correct. But there's short-term economic financial gain for the few, industrialists and politicians. and there's the long-term economic benefit of a sustainable, healthy environment. And in those areas where the wildlife does still exist, those communities, those countries are sitting on economic gold mines. That as there are fewer and fewer places left in the world where people can go and see these extraordinary animals in the wild, those places will become even more economically valuable. And with the money spent the right way and going back into the communities in the way that it should, but doesn't always, those countries will see the benefit of long-term environmental care. And that applies not just to Africa, it applies to every country in the world. I mean, we just have to look at America again to see just what will be catastrophic consequences of environmental legislation suppression, of climate change legislation suppression, of rolling back of laws related to clean air, to clean water, the consequences in increased medical bills, of reduced life expectancy. The list is endless. But just to be clear, this is not just a problem. The population is a problem. The population explosion is a problem in places like Africa, yes. But in terms of looking after the environment, that is a issue that applies to every single country in the world. And there are very few countries who are addressing it the way that they should.
I also wanted to ask about the Big Life Foundation, which you co-founded, and that works to combat poaching and other threats in Africa. I know from my work out in Africa that the threats to wildlife are changing rapidly and they're becoming more complex. Human-wildlife conflict that we just talked about with this empty world, as well as loss of habitat, they're becoming huge and growing threats, especially as populations expand. So could you talk a bit about some of the work Big Life is doing, especially on those areas, and where you see the front line of conservation being?
When we began Big Life, it was very much about poaching. It was basically triage. I was there in Kenya and Tanzania in 2010, watching elephants and other animals being killed on a weekly basis by poachers, with very few people in that particular area doing anything about it, either governmental or non-profit. And so the first things first was to deal with the poachers, which thanks to the brilliant leadership of Richard Bonham, my co-founder, and to the hard work of the local community rangers, the poaching has been almost completely eliminated. We haven't had a single elephant killed this year. And the incidence of killing of all animals since the Big Life's inception has been massively reduced. What came along second a number of years ago was, with the increasing population and the increasing invasion of farmland, was human-wildlife conflict, where far larger numbers of elephants were being killed by irate farmers whose crops were being destroyed by elephants raiding their farms than by poachers. And also lions and other predators being killed by herders whose livestock was preyed upon by those predators. So we then addressed that and have been building what is getting on for well over 100 kilometers of fence that separates the wild habitat from the farmland, which has resulted in a huge dramatic drop in the number of elephants being killed by farmers. And you can understand them wanting to do it. If your if your entire livelihood is being trampled on and destroyed in one night, you too would be tempted to pick up a spear and hurl it at the elephant doing that destruction. So much of what we do is to work in conjunction with the community. That if the community support conservation, we're on our way to winning. So conservation supports the community, then the community will support conservation. So also another program that's been going the whole time is reimbursement for herders who lose their livestock to wild predators. And what that means is they then don't go out and, by way of retribution, spear or poison innocent or otherwise lions, hyenas, cheetahs, whatever. So that's phase 2. So that's now being taken care of, the human-wildlife conflict. Now we get to part 3, which is by far and away the most challenging, the most consequential, the most daunting, and which we have not yet embarked upon, but we are going to have to in the coming years, which is, with the increasing population, the invasion of land and the subdivision of land. That what was basically what happens is that you've got a park like Amboseli National Park. It is 100,000 acres. That's about the size of the city of Philadelphia. It's nothing. 80% of the time, those animals don't stay in conveniently in the park. They move out into unprotected land, community land. That is where Big Life comes in. Those are the areas where Big Life patrols 1.6 million acres of Kenya and Tanzanian unprotected land. But because it's community land, it is now reaching a point where the communities are talking about subdividing the land into 20-acre lots. And each of them then having the ability to sell those 20 acres. So now what you've got is potentially an extremely rapid fragmentation of an entire ecosystem. And what that is going to require is a huge financial war chest to start leasing wildlife corridors for all those animals to safely migrate from one area to another. And as the population grows and grows, that's going to become quite a challenge.
Of course, all these issues, including human-wildlife conflict, they all come under the much larger issue now of climate change. I know you've been very vocal on climate change online. There's been a very youthful, new, energetic movement in the last few years, including Extinction Rebellion. Does that kind of movement give you hope? Do you see positive signs of change?
Yes and no. Yes, I think what we have seen with Greta Thunberg makes me weep with joy that one little girl starting alone with a placard outside Swedish Parliament in the space of a year can achieve what she has. And it shows that with the right person, with the right charisma, and the right words, a pretty rapid transformation of certain segments of the population is possible. The key part of that sentence being certain segments of the population. Because on the other hand, what we are seeing is a rise, as you know, of right-wing authoritarianism across the planet. You are seeing countries that are not just abdicating their duty in addressing climate change, but going in the opposite direction of where we need to go. They will go down in history as terrorists because they are creating what will be terror and for billions of people and animals across the planet in the coming decades. And it's the time that we have available. Obviously, we need to just all keep doing everything we can, no matter how small. Everything makes a difference. It's just interesting, for example, this isn't about climate change, but plastic, just how quickly so many of us have woken up to the horrors of plastic. I mean, as recently as a year ago, I was still using one-use plastic. I now try and do everything I can to not go anywhere near one-use plastic. And I think a lot of people are doing that. So, the point is, for example, coming back to This Empty World paints a very dark, disturbing vision, but I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't think there was hope. I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't think it was like, okay, here's what's happening. Now let's set about doing everything we can to address it, to mitigate it. And it doesn't matter how small your actions are. If everybody's doing something, that's better than doing nothing.
I was going to ask about that because This Empty World does have that very stark message. A lot of your work across the years, in my mind, has had that stark message, and the titles are also quite provocative and quite bleak. Is that what's required at the moment, do you think? Is this a time for quite bleak, stark messages?
Me personally, I think so. I don't know what it takes. Look, getting back to climate change, I have never successfully changed any climate change deniers' beliefs with facts at my fingertips. It's very demoralizing when nothing will change somebody's mind. And I can't for the life of me understand why so many people are that way.
The future is going to require converting people who are currently not convinced, though, isn't it?
Well, so, if you look at the process of the conversion of, say, certain climate change deniers, it goes from, no, it doesn't exist, to, okay, it exists, but it's not man-made, to, okay, it exists, it is man-made, but there's nothing that we can do to stop it, to then hopefully, all right, I get it, let's get cracking. It's like this 4-step process, and there's probably sub-steps within that I've overlooked.
I think that's as good a place to end as any. To anyone listening, we've been talking from where I am in Mexico to Nick, who's in the USA, so apologies for any blips in the sound during the podcast. Nick, thanks very much for being on the New Big Five podcast. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
You're very welcome, and I hope I haven't depressed too many of your listeners, but instead given them a reason to go out and do something to make the planet a better place, as corny and cliched as that sounds.
To everyone listening, please go on to the New Big Five website, newbig5.com, and vote for your choices to include in the New Big Five of wildlife photography. On the website, you can find many more podcasts, as well as interviews with photographers and conservationists, articles on climate change, conservation, and the world's wildlife, photography tips, photo galleries, and plenty more. Please help us spread the word about the New Big Five project by sharing it on social media. #NewBig5. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Vimeo. If you'd like to get involved with the project, drop us a line. Contact details are on the website. Thanks for listening.